We've all been there, that feeling of being completely swept off our feet, of being unable to think straight or function normally, all because of someone else and the intensity of our emotions towards them. But what if I told you that this feeling, this all-consuming desire, is often less about love and more about a desperate need for control and connection in our lives? You might remember that one friend or family member who seemed to change overnight, becoming overly possessive and clingy after meeting someone new, or that coworker who suddenly became obsessed with winning you over. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the toxic psychology of infatuation and relationship manipulation, and uncover the underlying patterns that drive us to become completely consumed by someone else. As we navigate the blurred lines between infatuation and obsession, it becomes clear that beneath the surface of our intense attraction lies a deeper motivation, the desperate need for validation and self-worth, often stemming from our unresolved childhood insecurities and deep-seated fears. What begins as an all-consuming desire for connection rapidly morphs into a toxic grasp for control, as we become increasingly fixated on the object of our obsession, desperate to possess and secure their emotional allegiance, ultimately suffocating the very bond we once sought to nurture. Meanwhile, our self-deception escalates as we convince ourselves that our partner is the source of our happiness, thereby conveniently shifting the responsibility of our emotional wellness from our own shoulders to theirs, essentially turning them into a magical elixir for our self-esteem. At this juncture, our attraction has transformed into an insatiable craving for validation, as we feverishly seek to bolster our ailing ego through the constant reaffirmation of our partner's love and approval, ultimately rendering our relationship a zero-sum game where only one person can emerge triumphant. However, beneath this facade of devotion and adoration lies the raw material of genuine human emotion, raw emotion. We have no real capacity to handle leaving us flailing in the wake of our own emotional recklessness, desperately attempting to recapture the initial euphoria of our infatuation by any means necessary. In the end, it becomes painfully apparent that our obsession has served not to bring us closer to our partner, but to push ourselves to the precipice of emotional exhaustion, as we wrestle with the crippling awareness that the very thing we once thought defined us, our attraction, has, in fact, been a shallow facade for our desperate longing to escape the abyss of our own emotional desolation. At this point, she's no longer drawn to his unique qualities, but rather to the sense of control and validation that comes with being needed so desperately. In a desperate bid for connection, people often surrender to infatuation, blinding themselves to the red flags that would normally send them running, and instead embracing the intoxicating high of being obsessively in love. He's drawn to her in part because she represents a way for him to avoid dealing with his own deep-seated insecurity and the painful awareness that he's not as lovable or desirable as he'd like to be. It's a tragic irony that the very thing that initially fueled our attraction often becomes the source of our prison sentence, as we become trapped in a never-ending cycle of need and validation. When we become obsessed with someone, we're often unconsciously motivated by a fear that they'll leave us, not because we're scared of abandonment per se, but because we're terrified of the painful introspection that would come with being single. As long as we're addicted to the rush of being in love, we're willfully blind to our own toxic patterns and the ways in which our obsessive behavior is slowly killing the very thing we claim to love. People often try to hide beneath a cloak of romance what's actually a desperation for control. When our insecurities and fears are projected onto a relationship, it can masquerade as intense attraction, but in reality, it's a cry for validation. The desire for power and control can masquerade as an intense passion, but it's really a means to an end, getting what we feel we can't obtain otherwise. Obsessive behavior stems from a lack of genuine connection and intimacy, which is instead hijacked by the need for constant reassurance and validation. When someone becomes infatuated with you, what they are really obsessed with is the feeling of being desired, not the actual person themselves. Manipulative power struggles often emerge from a place of insecurity, where individuals use coercion and guilt to mask feelings of inadequacy and validate their self-worth. We tend to perceive the obsessive behavior as something that originates entirely from the external stimuli, but in reality, it's often driven by a deep-seated need within us for self-validation, a desperate attempt to fill the chasm of insecurity that lies within. When we are so enamored with the idea of being in love that we can't see beyond the facade, it's often a reflection of our own deep-seated fears of being alone or unworthy of affection, and we try to compensate for this fear by becoming increasingly invested in the other person. On the surface, our actions may appear to be about loving or taking care of someone, but what we're really trying to achieve is a sense of control over our own lives, a control that feels lost in the uncertainty of love. The obsessive behavior we witness in these situations is often a coping mechanism for the fear of being rejected or abandoned, a desperate attempt to cling to something that seems more secure and predictable than the uncertainty of love. At its core, our obsession is driven by a fundamental need for self-definition, a need to establish our sense of identity and self-worth by tying it to the other person. And this is a classic example of how the ego manipulates us into creating our own self-deception. Ultimately, our obsession is a manifestation of our own internalized fears and insecurities, and it's not until we confront these deep-seated issues that we can even begin to break free from the toxic cycle of obsession and develop a more authentic and healthy relationship with ourselves and others. As we delve into the world of toxic attraction, it's essential to recognize that often, what appears to be infatuation is actually a desperate attempt to fill a void within ourselves, a void that stems from deeply rooted insecurities and vulnerabilities. Infatuation can be a coping mechanism for our own inadequacies, a misguided attempt to validate our self-worth through the attention of another person and their supposed love for us. What we perceive as a deep connection can often be rooted in a desire to control, to hold on to something that makes us feel important and valued, a desperate bid to cling to the fleeting sensation of being wanted. Toxic attraction is not about genuine connection, but rather about a twisted craving for validation, a constant need for reassurance that often takes the form of possessiveness and jealousy. When our attraction turns to obsession, it's usually because we're trying to compensate for a lack of self-love and self-acceptance, trying to fill the gaps in our own psyche with external sources of validation and love. Deep down, we're often drawn to people who reflect our own unmet emotional needs, people who unwittingly mirror our own fears, insecurities, and unresolved issues. And it's precisely this mirroring that creates a feedback loop of obsession and fixation, a toxic cycle that's almost impossible to break free from. Thank you for watching, and I want to leave you with a crucial takeaway: recognizing the signs of obsession is just the first step. It's up to you to create healthier relationships and habits. If you found this conversation insightful, be sure to like and comment below with your observations, and let's continue this conversation. For more thought-provoking discussions on human psychology, subscribe and tap into a world of self-discovery and exploration.